Refurbishing a vintage model steamboat. This is part 21 and it's superstructure repairs plus internal steam piping. This is a superstructure or part of the superstructure that sits on top of the boat. It's the important bit. This has to be lifted on and off, so it has to be a good fit. But first of all it has to be clean. It's very dusty. So I've removed the lifeboats and now I'm giving it a really good clean with a paintbrush. Not forgetting a vacuum cleaner because I don't really need to breathe in all this dust. In no time at all, the superstructure is looking much cleaner. I'm being really careful with the paintbrush, very gentle with the paintbrush, because if I break anything off, it will be sucked up the vacuum cleaner, and I don't really fancy spending an hour ferreting through the contents of the vacuum cleaner. Having a quick look at these lifeboats, they really are exceptionally well made. The attention to detail is stunning. Some of the details have actually broken off, and this of course is always a problem with fine scale models. What I'm doing here is fixing the rudder in place. The rudder's just sat in the ferrules as per full size. Unfortunately, in this scale I feel it's wholly impractical to have working rudders on the lifeboats, because what's going to happen with the vibration of the engine and the wind generated by the boat cutting through the air is just going to cause the rudders to be lost forever. Not to mention the problem of damaging them when you're cleaning the boat. And there are some fittings on these boats which are such fine scale, as I mentioned earlier, that are already broken off. However, I'm not going to glue these in place on the superstructure. I'll use a couple of small pieces of blue tack, I think. That should hold them on the mountings. Really, being practical, I should glue them in place, but it will be more difficult to clean around them, so I think blue tack or similar is the way to go. They're held in place but can be removed if you need to clean the boat. Unfortunately, this section of the superstructure is the one that's going to be most frequently handled, to remove it to lubricate the engine and refill the displacement lubricator. The parts of this model that have suffered the most damage over the years are the handrail stanchions and the handrails. Quite a few of them are broken. I have bought replacements for the entire stern section, but it's impractical on this job to fix every part, and once again I do like to do sympathetic restorations. I'm not building a new boat, if you see what I mean. And although I sound really calm at the moment, I am not in the slightest. This job drove me mad. Really mad. Very mad. What I thought about doing was getting a big stone paving slab, putting it on the bench just to bang my head against when the parts broke. Quite a lot of them looked okay until I touched them, and then they dropped from together. Thankfully, after taking some of my special tablets, I started to feel much better, and everything looked a lot better, and the colours were wonderful. So I'm now in a happy place where life is wonderful all the time, etc., etc. Right, back to the rebuild, renovation. First of all, I stick the part back in place with some cyanoacrylate adhesive. But this is not good enough because cyanoacrylate adhesive will fracture too easily. So then I overcoat the part with some epoxy resin. But the job is just incredibly fiddly, and there are quite a lot of them broken. As you can clearly see in this clip, I'm using a spring clamp to hold the stanchions in place while I fit the handrail. But it's important not to use a spring clip with too much pressure. These long ones are just about right. One of the problems that I had with this job, apart from it being the worst job I've ever done, is putting these in place. These are the handrails, and all I have to do is hold them in place until the cyanoacrylate adhesive grabs, but unfortunately the cyanoacrylate adhesive grabbed to my finger quicker, so when I removed my hand, the handrail came with it. At the moment it looks like there is nothing happening on screen, and indeed there's nothing happening on screen as I'm phoning my therapist. No, actually I'm not. What I'm doing is removing the cyanoacrylate adhesive from my fingers, and in a moment I'm going to start again. I always knew that this job needed doing, and I wasn't looking forward to it. However, I will get there in the end, and it is an important part of the job, because it wouldn't look good to just leave these broken. One or two of them are going to have to be bent, as you can see, because they are that way. If I try and straighten them, they will fracture. It all adds to the charm of the model, and it's all part of the model. A few years ago, a customer had a model specially built and sent it to me to fit it with a steam plant, and it was beautifully made, this model. but so weak. In the end, I turned the job down and said, look, I just can't do this job. The entire boat is falling from together and I haven't touched it yet. The builder had used an absolute minimum of adhesive on the boat, which made the whole thing very weak. This is definitely not the case with this boat, and by the time I've done this job and everything's in place, reinforced with epoxy resin, and then overpainted in white, it should look quite good. This clip shows me cutting a piece of brass wire to the correct length, because the existing one was not a good fit at all. Finally, when I get this piece of brass wire to fit, it's looking good. So once the handrails are fitted in place using cyanoacrylate adhesive, I'm now mixing up a small quantity of epoxy resin. This is 2-pack 5-minute epoxy, which I'm going to carefully overcoat the joint. And this needs to be done on every one of the fractured handrails. I've mentioned this before in other videos, but just for the record, this is 2-pack epoxy resin, equal amounts on a piece of board, and then mix the two parts together thoroughly until they take on a milky appearance. If you don't do that, you will not get a strong bond. In the past, when repairing model aircraft, not the ones I'd built, usually ones that other people had built, I have noticed that the epoxy resin was quite rubbery in places. That means I think it wasn't mixed properly. You will notice that on one of the stanchions, the ball end is missing. So there are a couple of options here. This is a small piece of lead shot. I can glue this on the top if I wish to. Alternatively, I could create a ball for the end of the stanchion with some milliput epoxy putty. I've described the use of this a couple of episodes ago for doing some strengthening inside the boat, which by the way was very successful, and the structure of the boat now is immensely strong. For the moment, I think I'll try the lead shot method. Here I'm cleaning off some of the cyano that ran down the stanchion. And just for the record, I'm using medium viscosity cyano. Do not use the thin runny stuff, it will run everywhere. And I do find the viscous stuff to be a little bit too gloopy. So medium is a good compromise. While the epoxy resin is setting, I'm going to move on to another damaged area. Once again, this was really badly damaged, and I'm not going to show the fixing of it because all you can see is my great big hands in the way. It was more difficult than the other one that I showed, but now it looks okay and it's quite strong. If you're doing a job like this, you need an incredible amount of patience. I was lucky I was taught patience by my father, because my father didn't have much patience. He was a pretty good woodworker, but when he worked with anything small, like for instance a 00 gauge model railway engine, and it was usually my 00 gauge model railway engine, it would end up thrown across the room because he would lose all the parts on the floor and generally lose all patience with it. So when he'd finished having a tantrum, I used to pick up the parts and put them back together. And yes, sometimes it took a while, but I didn't ever want to do it like my father did, because you don't fix things by throwing them across the room. It was a lesson well learnt. And talking about patience, this is going to need considerable patience. This pipe that you can see sticking down into the boat is the outlet for the safety valve. So somehow I have to find a way of making this fit over the safety valve, or an extension piece fit over the safety valve, and then make the superstructure very easy to pop on and off. As I mentioned earlier on in this episode, this part of the superstructure will be removed frequently to allow filling of the displacement lubricator and lubrication of the steam engine. So the fitting needs to be a quick release affair. More about this later. While you weren't looking, I made the exhaust piping for the chimney to the condenser, and also the exhaust piping from the exhaust of the engine to the condenser. And this is the short exhaust pipe that goes from the exhaust of the engine to the condenser, and here it is fitted in position. That's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful.